The first time I saw the fence, I thought it had to be a mistake. A cruel prank, maybe. A construction error. But no, there it was, a raw stretch of cedar planks stabbing into the soil just 6 feet from my back porch, running clean across the edge of my property like a scar. It didn't just block my view of the lake, it cut me off from it entirely. And standing at the far corner, arms folded, was Karen. She smiled like a cat who'd finally taught the bird it had been hunting for months. The sun was barely up, golden light spilling over the water, but the sound of her voice cut through it like broken glass. "You're trespassing, actually," she said. Trespassing? On my own land? You ever have a moment so surreal you wonder if you're dreaming? That was mine. I could smell the fresh sawdust still clinging to the air, and all I could think was, how long had she been planning this? The fence looked new enough to shine. The posts were cemented in deep, no amateur job. Someone had been here overnight with a crew. Karen hadn't just claimed a piece of the lake, she had invaded my yard like a general planting a flag. And in that moment, staring down at her smug little smirk, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't random. This was war. Now, I know what you're thinking. How does someone even get away with this? How could one neighbor wake up one morning and decide they own your shoreline? The answer lies in 3 letters that should send chills down your spine. HOA. Our homeowners association was supposed to protect property values. What it really did was give Karen, a retired accountant with too much time and too many grudges, the keys to a kingdom she never deserved. And I was about to become her favorite target. 3 weeks earlier, the fight had started small. It always does. I had received one of those infamous courtesy letters in the mail. The envelope bore the HOA's official seal, but the handwriting on the inside was all Karen. Neat, sharp, judgmental. It said, "My lakeside landscaping encroached upon community property lines and must be rectified immediately." What landscaping? I had a few potted plants and a dock my family used for fishing, nothing more. Still, she had declared war on it. And if you know anything about HOAs, you know those letters are the opening salvo. They're never courtesies, they're threats. I ignored the first one, thinking it had to be a mistake. Maybe she'd confused my lot with someone else's. But then came the second letter, this time with a fine attached. $75 for unapproved lakeside modifications. Modifications? I hadn't built anything new since moving in. That's when I started digging into the bylaws. Pages and pages of dense legal jargon written to confuse and control. Section 4.2.3 in particular said, "Common waterfront access shall remain unobstructed for the benefit of all residents." But here's the catch. My deed clearly showed private shoreline rights extending 20 feet into the lake. Private, as in mine. And yet Karen had twisted that vague phrase into justification to treat my land like her own. The neighbors whispered about it. At the mailbox, I overheard one say, "Karen's at it again," shaking his head. At the HOA meeting that month, she sat at the head of the table, pearls gleaming against her beige blazer, and announced new guidelines for lake usage. I remember her exact words, "We can't have individuals claiming special privileges." Her eyes flicked toward me when she said it. My stomach turned cold. That's when I realized this wasn't confusion, this was personal. So when I walked out that morning and saw the fence, I knew it wasn't a mistake. It was a message. I marched up to her, voice shaking more from rage than fear. "This is my property, Karen. You can't just build here." She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She tilted her head like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "Actually," she said, "the board voted to designate this portion as community waterfront. The fence is to establish boundaries." My jaw dropped. A board vote? I hadn't heard about any vote. No notice, no agenda, nothing. But she had the audacity to wave a printed sheet in my face. HOA minutes she'd typed up herself, probably at midnight, in that neat, sharp handwriting, and every signature at the bottom looked suspiciously similar. That's when the panic set in. Because here's the ugly truth about HOAs. Once they write something down, once they file it, you're fighting uphill. The law usually sides with them unless you have ironclad proof they overstepped. And Karen knew it. She'd been on the board for years, long enough to know the loopholes and how to weaponize them. I was the new guy, barely 3 years in the neighborhood. Easy prey. Or so she thought. I took pictures of the fence, every angle, every post. I called the county zoning office that afternoon, and the man on the other end sighed like he'd heard it all before. "If it's HOA internal enforcement, we can't intervene," he said. My stomach sank. That was Karen's power. She operated in the gray zone, just outside the law, but under its protection. Still, I filed a complaint anyway, just to have it on record. Paper trails matter. And I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let her win this quietly. The confrontation escalated days later. I came home from work to find Karen and 2 other board members standing on my deck. On my deck! Clipboard in hand, she was pointing to my grill, my chairs, even my fishing poles, scribbling notes, unapproved structures, like an executioner reading a sentence. I snapped, "Get off my property!" And for a moment the mask slipped. Her face hardened, lips thin as a blade. "You'll regret this." And then she left, heels clicking like a gavel-striking marble. That night I couldn't sleep. The fence loomed outside my window like a prison wall, the lake beyond it shimmering with freedom I could no longer touch. I kept replaying her words in my head, "You'll regret this." The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about property lines, it was about power. Karen had to win, and I had to lose. That was her rule. But here's the thing about rules. They can be broken or rewritten. So I started planning. I dug into the bylaws deeper than ever before, marking every contradiction, every loophole. I reached out to a neighbor I'd overheard grumbling about fines, asked him for copies of his letters. One by one, the pieces of Karen's pattern emerged. Selective enforcement, falsified votes, intimidation tactics. This wasn't just about me. This was a system, and systems can be dismantled. But in that moment, in the first chapter of this nightmare, I stood alone. One man, one fence, one lake I could no longer reach. My shoreline had disappeared, swallowed by Karen's obsession. And as I stared at that wall of cedar, a single question burned in my mind. If she could take this from me, what would she come for next?
The sound of Karen's binder slamming against the folding table echoed like a gunshot. Papers spilled out across the surface, her pearls swinging forward as she leaned in with both hands, eyes scanning the room like a judge about to deliver a sentence. "Effective immediately," she announced. "Waterfront access will be standardized under the authority of the HOA. No exceptions." My stomach dropped. My dock, my shoreline, everything I'd worked for was suddenly at risk of becoming community property. The room went dead silent. You could hear the buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead, the faint crackle of a styrofoam cup crumpling in some neighbor's nervous grip. Karen thrived in that silence. She fed on it. Her voice rose, sharp and rehearsed. "For too long, certain residents have acted as though they own more than their fair share of the lake. That ends tonight." I could feel every eye in the room flick toward me, quick glances they were too afraid to hold. And Karen's smirk widened just enough to tell me this wasn't about the lake. It was about me. Now let me pause and ask you, have you ever watched a room of grown adults fold under the weight of one woman's authority? It's like watching a school teacher scold a classroom. Except in this case, the teacher had no real power, only the illusion of it, wrapped in bylaws and intimidation. The HOA's governing documents didn't give Karen unilateral control. They required notice, quorum, a vote. But Karen understood something most people didn't. Perception is power. If she declared a rule confidently enough, Most folks assumed it was law, and fear kept the rest quiet. 3 weeks earlier, the board had circulated a meeting notice about clarifying lake privileges. The language was vague, deliberately so. I hadn't realized then that clarify really meant seize. Karen always hid behind words that seemed harmless: streamline, standardize, protect. Each one was a mask for control. And now, as I sat in that cramped community center with the smell of stale donuts and burnt coffee clinging to the air, the mask was off. The so-called guidelines she laid out weren't guidelines at all. They were restrictions. Dock lengths capped at 6 feet. No permanent seating within 15 feet of the waterline. All existing structures subject to board review. My dock stretched nearly 20 feet, well within my deeded rights, but suddenly a violation under Karen's new regime. She didn't even look at the paper when she read it. She'd memorized it. She'd been waiting for this moment. I raised my hand. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Excuse me, but these rules conflict with county property records. Some of us own lakefront rights." Karen didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. She tilted her head, pearls catching the light. "Those records," she said, "are outdated. This community has chosen to move forward as one. We're equalizing access." Equalizing, as if stripping away my deeded rights was some noble act of fairness. The neighbors shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. That was Karen's gift, turning silence into consent. The man next to me, Roger, cleared his throat like he might add something. Karen's eyes snapped to him, and he looked down at his coffee. One by one, the others did the same. I was alone, and Karen knew it. "If anyone has concerns," she continued, "they may submit them in writing to the board. But understand, this has already been voted on." That's when I noticed the signatures at the bottom of her printed sheet. 5 names, all from board members. 3 of them were her close friends, women I'd seen at her house for wine nights, laughing loud enough to echo across the cul-de-sac. The vote wasn't a vote. It was a coronation. Later that night, I cornered one of those board members, a man named Ed, by the parking lot. He was older, retired, the kind of guy who usually kept to himself. "Ed," I said, "did you really vote for this?" His face flushed. He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes darting toward the building. "Karen," he said, "she said it was just a formality, that we needed to streamline access to prevent disputes. I didn't realize—" He cut himself off when Karen's laugh rang out behind us. She was still inside, packing up her binder. Ed lowered his voice. "Don't make me your ally. I've seen what happens." And with that, he walked away, leaving me staring at his retreating back. That was the first time I truly understood how Karen operated. She ruled through fear. Not direct threats, though she was capable of those, but subtle consequences. Fines that piled up. Lawn inspections that never ended. Letters that made your blood pressure spike just opening them. People complied not because they believed in her authority, but because resisting her was exhausting. And exhaustion is a powerful weapon. A week later, I got the letter. Thick envelope, HOA seal, same neat, sharp handwriting. Notice of violation, non-compliant dock. It listed a fine of $150, escalating weekly until corrective action was taken. I stood at my kitchen counter reading it over and over, the words blurring. Corrective action meant tearing down the dock I'd built with my father before he passed away. Every board, every nail, every memory, gone. That's when anger turned to resolve. Because if Karen thought she could erase my property, but my history, she'd underestimated me. I started documenting everything, meeting minutes, letters, emails. I spoke with the county clerk's office, pulling up subdivision plots and easements. And the more I dug, the clearer it became. Karen was overstepping. HOA bylaws can regulate aesthetics, sure, paint colors, fence heights, things that affect community harmony. But deeded property rights? Those are protected by state law. She wasn't just bluffing. She was gambling I wouldn't fight back. One evening, I caught Karen on my shoreline, clipboard in hand, measuring tape stretched across the dock. "Gathering evidence," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I pulled out my phone, recording her. "You know this is trespassing, right?" Her laugh was soft, like she was humoring me. "You'll learn how this works," she replied, and walked away, heels digging into the soft earth like she owned it. That moment became my turning point. I wasn't just going to fight her fines, I was going to dismantle her rule. But I couldn't do it alone. And that night, as the lake lapped quietly against the dock she wanted to destroy, I realized something important. In every dictatorship, there's resistance, even in an HOA. Still, Karen had the upper hand. She controlled the narrative, the board, the flow of information. She had the neighbors too scared to raise their heads. And as I stared at that violation notice pinned to my fridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was just getting started. Because if she could twist equal access into justification for seizing my shoreline, what else could she rewrite? What else could she take? And so the question burned in my mind, louder than the chorus of crickets that night. If Karen's golden rule was that she owned the lake, how far was she willing to go to make sure I drowned under it?
Unapproved lawn chairs, illegal umbrella, dock too close to water. Karen's voice cracked like a gavel against the morning air as her pen scratched accusations onto the clipboard. I stood frozen on the deck, coffee in hand, as she snapped photo after photo. My property transformed into her personal crime scene. She clicked the camera again. The shutter echoed like handcuffs snapping shut. She scribbled in bold strokes, pages tearing under the weight of her pen. She didn't glance at me, like I wasn't a neighbor, but a suspect. Each photo felt like evidence for a trial I hadn't agreed to. Neighbors' blinds shifted, slivers of eyes catching the drama from behind safe glass. The dog barked down the street. No one came outside. The air smelled of cut grass and something sour. Fear, or maybe inevitability. And me? I felt the weight of the HOA bylaws like chains I'd never signed up to wear. 3 weeks earlier, I'd dismissed the envelope she slipped under my door. A courtesy notice, stamped in red, citing minor infractions that didn't exist. Supposedly, my deck furniture wasn't on the approved list. Never mind that I'd bought it from the same store half the neighborhood shopped at. The bylaws mentioned materials, colors, even weight limits, but nothing about Adirondack chairs with navy cushions. Still, the language in her letter made it sound like a violation punishable by fines escalating to liens. Who would question it? Most people just paid. That morning, as she stalked across my deck, clipboard snapping, I remembered the conversation from the last HOA reading. She'd leaned across the folding table, pearl necklace clinking, and said, "We need to enforce inspections more aggressively. Property values are at stake." No one challenged her. They never did. Because Karen spoke with a tone that made you feel like disagreeing would cost you more than you could afford. I finally set my mug down, forcing my voice steady. "Karen, you can't just barge onto my property without notice." She turned, lips tight, eyes bright with the thrill of confrontation. "Actually," she tapped her pen against the clipboard like it was a weapon, "per Section 7.3 of the HOA Covenants, the board reserves the right to conduct property inspections to ensure compliance. You agreed to this when you purchased." Her words dripped with practiced certainty. And here's the truth. Most people would believe her. But I'd read the bylaws. Section 7.3 allowed inspections of common areas and shared facilities. Not private decks, not my dock. She was bluffing, but she knew bluffs worked when no one else wanted to fight. "You'll be receiving a formal notice." She snapped one last picture of the umbrella over my table, its fabric flapping gently in the morning breeze. "Failure to comply will result in fines." I wanted to laugh, but my chest tightened instead, because fines were her favorite weapon. $10 a day for an unapproved flower pot, $50 for a non-conforming mailbox, $100 for leaving trash cans visible for 5 minutes past pickup. Death by paper cuts, all signed in HOA letterhead. By noon, the notice was taped to my front door. Inspection report, non-compliance. A list of violations filled the page. 2 lawn chairs, color not consistent with neighborhood palette. Patio umbrella, unauthorized installation. Dock placement, encroachment upon common waterway. It was absurd, but absurdity didn't matter. What mattered was that the fines began the moment the notice hit my door. I called the management company that afternoon. A board clerk put me on hold for 17 minutes, then returned with the line that stuck in my head like static. You'll need to submit a compliance form or appeal in writing. Processing takes 30 days. Fines accrue in the meantime. 30 days, 30 fines. That was the game. When I confronted Karen later that week, because of course I did, I found her in her driveway polishing her beige SUV like it was an idol. She didn't look up as I spoke. You know none of those violations hold up under the bylaws. Her rag moved in slow circles over the hood. Then appeal, she answered flatly. But you'll still owe the fines until the board votes. And there it was, the unspoken truth. The board. The very people who'd nodded in silence at the last meeting, unwilling to cross her. Karen didn't just chair the committee, she controlled it. At night, I caught the whispers. Neighbors at the mailbox, voices low. Did you hear what she cited him for? She fined me last month over a flower box. But they never spoke louder, because speaking louder meant a notice taped to your own door. Fear kept them quiet. Fear kept Karen in power. 2 weeks into the inspection war, I began documenting everything. Photos of the chairs, measurements of the dock, copies of bylaws highlighted in yellow. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was building a case. But cases take time, and Karen knew how to use every day against me. One evening, a knock rattled my door. A neighbor, eyes darting like a fugitive, slipped an envelope into my hand. Inside, photocopies of past inspection reports. Identical language, identical accusations. She'd been using the same template against half the street, only changing the names. "Don't tell her I gave you this," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder toward Karen's house. "She'll make my life hell." It was proof. Not enough to end it, but enough to show the pattern. Enough to know I wasn't alone. The next morning, Karen strutted down my sidewalk again, clipboard in hand, her shadow stretching across my lawn like a sundial marking out the hours she owned. I stepped onto the porch before she could climb the steps. "Karen, you've made your point." She paused, tilting her head, eyes narrowing. "I'll stop when you comply." But compliance wasn't her goal. Control was. And for the first time, I felt the shift inside me. Not fear, but resolve. If she wanted a war of inspections, I'd give her something she didn't expect. Resistance. That day, I filed my first formal appeal, citing bylaws line by line. I copied the management company, the board members, even the city zoning office. Karen wanted me isolated. Instead, I pulled more eyes onto the battlefield. Still, the fines piled up. Notices arrived like clockwork. Non-compliance, penalty increased. Each envelope was a reminder Karen wasn't done. She was just beginning. And yet, as I slid the latest notice into my growing stack, I couldn't shake the thought. If she was this bold in daylight, what would she try next when no one was watching?
I've had enough of her, too. Those words weren't shouted at a meeting or muttered through clenched teeth in passing. They were whispered to me. Just as the lake reflected the dying light of day, soft ripples glowing orange and gold. A neighbor, someone I'd never had more than a casual hello with, stood there with a folded packet of papers in his hand. His tone wasn't angry. It was careful, like someone stepping into enemy territory for the first time. I'll never forget that moment, because up until then, I thought it was just me versus her. Just me and the stack of violation notices taped to my door, each one sharper than the last. Just me under the magnifying glass of Karen's inspections, feeling the weight of neighbors' silence pressing down like a lid. But now there was a crack in the wall. The neighbor's name was Tom, though everyone on the street knew him only as the quiet guy with the fishing boat. He lived 2 doors down, kept his head low, paid his dues on time, and avoided the HOA spotlight like it carried a disease. That evening, he leaned against my fence post, lowering his voice to a near hiss. "She fined me last month," he said. "Claimed my trailer was parked too close to the curb. I measured it myself. It wasn't. She just wanted to make a point." His words came out in bursts, the way people talk when they're holding back months of frustration. He handed me the papers, copies of his violation letters, complete with dates and escalating fines. Different issue, same handwriting, the template I'd recognized too well. You might think neighbors would rally when faced with the same enemy, but in an HOA, fear keeps everyone isolated. Pay the fine, stay off her radar, pretend you're in compliance. That's how Karen kept control. She didn't just enforce bylaws, she weaponized them. She knew the average homeowner wouldn't dare challenge her interpretation. But Tom was different. He was tired, and he was willing to risk something. That night, under the fading glow of the street lamps, we compared notes like conspirators. My unapproved chairs, his illegal trailer. The dates lined up, suspiciously close to board meetings when Karen wanted to make a show of power. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe she was manufacturing violations to justify her authority. The next day, I started testing the waters with others. Not openly, you couldn't be too obvious. I brought it up in passing while walking the dog or at the mailbox when someone lingered too long. "Did she ever find you for something strange?" I'd ask, casual, like I wasn't fishing for evidence. The answers trickled in. A flower box cited for being non-uniform, a shed called excessive structure, even Christmas lights deemed non-compliant because they stayed up 2 days past New Year's. Each story was whispered, eyes scanning to make sure Karen wasn't within earshot. By the end of that week, there were 4 of us. Myself, Tom, a retired teacher named Grace, who still had the notice accusing her of unauthorized exterior paint, even though she used the approved color code, and Brian, a young dad whose only crime had been letting his kid's bike sit too long on the front lawn. We didn't call it a resistance, not yet, but that's what it was. We met in places Karen wouldn't suspect, at the back of the community playground while kids swung in the twilight, or around Grace's kitchen table with blinds pulled tight. Emails followed, carefully worded, subject lines disguised. No one used the word Karen. Instead, she became the board chair or the inspector. Do you know the first thing we did? We pulled out the bylaws, all 62 pages of them. Dry language, legal jargon, clauses about easements and assessments. But buried in that text was the truth. Her power wasn't absolute. The board had to vote. Notices required proof. Fines had to follow due process. Karen, we realized, was skipping steps. She was issuing notices without documented approval. She was interpreting vague language as hard law. And most dangerously, she was enforcing rules selectively, targeting certain homes while ignoring others. Grace was the one who suggested we document everything, she said, paper trail, tapping the table with a teacher's precision. If she wants to play official, we'll beat her at her own game. So we began. Every notice photographed. Every envelope time-stamped. Meeting minutes requested from the management company under our right as dues-paying members. Even the HOA's financial reports, which most people never bothered to look at. It was tedious work, the kind of thing that makes your eyes blur and your brain itch. But patterns began to emerge. Karen wasn't just power-hungry, she was strategic. Notices clustered around certain dates, usually right before budget approvals or elections. Homes that voted against her proposals mysteriously cited within weeks. One night, as we spread documents across Tom's dining room table, he leaned back and muttered, "This isn't enforcement, this is intimidation." And he was right. That's when our alliance stopped being about just fighting fines. It became about something bigger, breaking her grip before she bled the whole neighborhood dry. The first real escalation came at the next board meeting. Picture it. Folding chairs lined up in the community center, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a stale smell of coffee lingering in the air. Karen sat at the head of the table, clipboard in front of her, like a judge preparing a sentence. When it came time for resident comments, Tom stood. His voice didn't shake. He asked calmly why his trailer fine hadn't gone through proper appeal channels. Karen's pen froze mid-note. The room went quiet. I filed the appeal within the 10-day window. Per Section 5.4, the board was required to vote, but there's no record in the minutes. Every eye in the room shifted. Karen's lips tightened. "We handle minor appeals administratively," she said smoothly. "No need to burden the board." But the seed of doubt was planted because she hadn't expected him to cite the section number. She hadn't expected anyone to know the rules as well as she did. After the meeting, she cornered me in the parking lot, pearl necklace gleaming under the sodium lights. "You've been talking," she accused. I met her stare, heart pounding, but voice steady. "People are starting to notice patterns." For the first time, I saw something flicker in her expression. Not anger, fear. It was quick, gone in an instant, but it was there. That fear told me something important. She knew her power had limits, and she knew we were getting close to finding them. The alliance grew quieter, tighter. We stopped meeting in person, switched to late-night phone calls and encrypted group chats. Each message carried the thrill of secrecy, like spies trading intelligence behind enemy lines. But with secrecy came risk, because the more we gathered, the more dangerous it became if she discovered us. One evening, Grace called, her voice trembling. "There was a car parked outside my house for 20 minutes, lights off. Didn't recognize it. You think it's her?" Paranoia spreads fast when you're living under surveillance, real or imagined. I told her it was nothing. But truthfully, I didn't know. What I did know was that Karen's grip was slipping. She was still powerful, still armed with her clipboard and her fines, but for the first time, she wasn't unchallenged. Behind closed doors, in whispers and secret emails, we were building something she couldn't control. And yet, as I looked out my window that night, blinds drawn tight, I couldn't help but wonder, how long before she found out we weren't just neighbors anymore? We were her opposition.
Unauthorized seizure of private property. Those 5 words echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Karen's pearl necklace clattered against your chest as she fumbled with her stack of papers, cheeks flushed crimson. The judge's gavel slammed once, sharp, final, and in that instant, the carefully constructed empire Karen had built on fines, fear, and manipulation began to crack. You should have seen the room. The smell of polished oak benches and stale coffee from the courthouse vending machine hung in the air. My palms were slick, my chest tight, but my eyes stayed locked on her. For months, she had paraded around the neighborhood with her clipboard and her bylaws, dictating what we could plant, where we could park, how we could breathe. Now, for the first time, she wasn't in charge. She was cornered. And I'll tell you this, you're about to learn exactly how we got her there. Because it wasn't luck, it was strategy. Painstaking, methodical, and maybe a little petty. 3 weeks earlier, I was still neck-deep in violation notices. My unapproved umbrella had turned into a $250 fine. Tom's trailer citations were snowballing into threats of lien placement. Grace's paint violation had advanced to a final warning that her property could be subject to corrective action. Karen's language was always clinical, professional on the surface, but underneath it was intimidation dressed up in Times New Roman. We were tired of playing defense, so we went on offense. It started with Brian, remember, the young dad whose kids left bikes on the lawn? He had a buddy who was a real estate attorney, someone who knew his way around HOA bylaws like a hunter knows a map of the woods. One evening, at Grace's dining table, Brian connected us over speakerphone. "This isn't enforcement," the attorney said after we explained. His voice was calm but edged with disbelief. "She's issuing fines without proper hearings, and in some cases, she's threatening actions she legally can't take." I remember looking around the table. Tom leaned forward, eyes lit up. Grace whispered, "I knew it." And me? I felt something I hadn't in months. Hope. The attorney explained the key. Due process. HOAs can fine, yes. They can enforce, but they have to follow procedure. Notice of violation, opportunity to appeal, documented board vote. Skip a step, and suddenly the HOA isn't enforcing rules, it's violating rights. We needed proof Karen was skipping steps. That's where our paper trail came in. We gathered emails, minutes, and letters. We highlighted discrepancies, dates that didn't line up, votes that never appeared in meeting minutes, fines issued without appeals. Piece by piece, the evidence stacked higher. Then came the turning point. Grace found a letter in her files that stopped us cold. It was a corrective action notice, threatening that if she didn't repaint her house, the HOA may hire contractors to perform necessary work and bill the owner accordingly. She hadn't missed the detail before, but under a lawyer's eye, it was gold. That, the attorney said, is unauthorized seizure of private property. An HOA can't just hire someone and send you the bill without going through a legal process. That's grounds for a lawsuit. And just like that, the plan shifted. We weren't just resisting Karen anymore. We were taking her to court. The weeks that followed were electric. Every knock on the door made me wonder if Karen somehow knew. Every time I saw her at the end of my driveway, clipboard in hand, I felt like a spy whose cover might be blown. But we kept going. We filed the claim through small claims court first, knowing it would force her hand. We asked for injunctive relief. Stop the fines. Stop the threats. Stop the overreach. When the notice of hearing was served, neighbors buzzed. Karen didn't say much, but I saw the way she stiffened when she read the envelope at her mailbox. Her empire had been built on the assumption no one would challenge her. Now someone had. Court day came on a Tuesday. Cloudy, humid, the kind of day where the sky feels like wet wool pressing down on your shoulders. I sat in the back row with Tom and Grace. Brian couldn't make it, work obligations, but his attorney friend was there, sitting at our table with a neat stack of binders. Karen swept in like she was attending a gala, pearls glinting, hair pulled tight, binder clutched to her chest like armor. She gave me a quick, sharp glance, the kind that said, "You'll regret this." The judge called the case. Homeowners versus the Lakeside Neighborhood Association. His voice was dry and efficient, like he'd heard it all before. Karen went first. She launched into a monologue about community standards and uniformity. She painted us as disruptive, irresponsible neighbors, undermining the neighborhood's value. She held up photos of my lawn chairs, Tom's trailer, Grace's paint swatches. She stacked her binder with paper like ammunition, slapping each exhibit down as if the sound alone proved her case. Then it was our turn. Our attorney didn't bluster. He didn't grandstand. He simply opened the binder and began with Grace's letter. He read the line aloud. The HOA may hire contractors to perform necessary work and bill the owner accordingly. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then he asked the judge a simple question. Where in the governing documents or state law is this authority granted?
The silence that followed was deafening. Karen shifted in her seat, flipping papers, searching for something, anything that justified her threat, but there was nothing, because the authority didn't exist. The attorney continued, laying out example after example. Notices without hearings, appeals filed but never voted on, meeting minutes missing from the record, fines issued without appeals. Piece by piece, the evidence stacked higher. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. His gaze turned to Karen. "Is this true? Were these actions taken without a recorded board vote?" Her voice faltered the first time. "Well, some matters are handled informally." "Informal action is not due process," the judge interrupted. That's when he said it, the words that cracked a room open. Unauthorized seizure of private property. The gavel struck, and for the first time, Karen's power wasn't absolute. It was checked. I wish I could say the courtroom erupted, that neighbors burst into applause, but no, it was quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear someone's pride collapse in real time. Karen sat frozen, pearls trembling against her collarbone, binder pressed to her chest like armor. She didn't glare, she didn't yell, she just muttered, low enough for only me to hear. "This isn't over." And I believed her, because with people like Karen, it never is. The courtroom had clipped her wings, but it hadn't broken her. She would come back, angrier, more desperate, looking for new ways to twist the rules. As I stood there on the courthouse steps, papers still warm in my hand, I couldn't help but wonder, what would she try next, and how far was she willing to go to get back what she thought she owned?
The county inspector signed off this morning, Mrs. Whitaker. The pier is here to stay. Those were the exact words that cracked her mask. I remember the courtroom win from the week before, the ink still drying on the judge's order, but this moment, this was sweeter. Karen's lips thinned, her mower engine stuttered, and for the first time in years, I watched her retreat instead of advance. Coffee in my hand, sunrise bleeding orange over the lake, timber creaking under my boots. That was the cold open of my private rebellion. You see, Karen's crusade had always been about control. Every inch of grass, every color of siding, every holiday wreath, she clung to the HOA bylaws like they were scripture. And the pier? The pier was her line in the sand. She called it a threat to community uniformity and a safety hazard, though the truth was simpler. She didn't want anyone else enjoying what she couldn't control. How many denial letters did I receive? 6. Each one typed on HOA letterhead, her signature at the bottom in that looping cursive she thought looked regal. Each one citing a different clause, twisted just enough to sound official. Setback requirements, visual obstruction, environmental disruption. Always vague enough to intimidate, always confident I wouldn't fight back. But I did. It started 3 months earlier, at a zoning hearing Karen didn't even know I attended. I had discovered a loophole buried in county code. Any property abutting the lake had riparian rights. In plain English, the water line was mine to access. The HOA could regulate paint swatches and mailbox height, sure, but the shoreline, that was governed by the county, not Karen. I'll never forget sitting in that municipal office, the air sharp with toner and stale coffee, while a clerk stamped my application. "Once the environmental survey clears, you'll be good," she said, sliding the papers across the counter. I walked out lighter like I was carrying a weapon Karen didn't know existed. Of course, she found out. She always did. 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived, heavy with threat. "Construction of any pier is unauthorized under Article V, Section 14 of the HOA bylaws. Cease and desist immediately, or further action will be taken." I almost laughed. Article V, Section 14 covered community amenities, the pool, the shared tennis court. Nothing about private piers. But that's the trick, isn't it?
Most homeowners wouldn't bother to check. Most would fold under the fear of escalating fines. Not me. "You're really going through with this?" my neighbor Paul asked one evening as we sat on his porch, a cooler between us. Paul had been one of my quiet allies, the kind of man who'd lived here 20 years and learned to keep his head down. "I've gone through worse," I told him. "She thinks a letter scares me? Let her send 100. I've got the county seal." And so the battle shifted from whispers to open war. Karen began circling my lot like a hawk, phone in hand, snapping pictures of lumber deliveries. She marched up to the contractors I hired, waving her clipboard like a badge, declaring, "This site is in violation." One of the guys quit after she followed him to his truck, shouting that she'd see to it his license was revoked. But here's where it gets delicious. Every outburst, every false claim, every interruption, I documented it all. Dates, times, even video from a camera tucked into my upstairs window. I knew the county board valued evidence, not theatrics. 3 weeks before completion, Karen escalated. She convened an emergency HOA meeting, her voice shrill as she rattled off a motion to fine me $250 a day until the pier construction ceased. I stood in that fluorescent-lit clubhouse, the smell of burnt coffee and mildew heavy in the air, and let her rant. Then, when she finally paused for breath, I slid a folder on the table. County permit, environmental survey, approved design, signed by the inspector. Silence. You could have heard the hum of the air conditioner cut through the room. The other board members shifted in their seats, eyes darting between us. And then Karen, she tried to pivot, claiming, "This isn't about legality, it's about aesthetics." Aesthetics. That was her last refuge. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. The board lawyer cleared his crack and said flatly, "If it's permitted by the county, the HOA has no authority to override." And just like that, her gavel cracked in half. Now here's where the story could have ended. Construction finished, I enjoyed my pier, and Karen stewed quietly in her living room. But Karen wasn't built for quiet. No, she doubled down, filing a civil complaint that the pier diminished community value. That's how we ended up in court. Fluorescent lights glaring off polished wood, a judge peering over wire-rimmed glasses. Her complaint was dismissed in less than 10 minutes. And that's how I found myself here. Coffee in my hand, morning sun kissing the lake, timber solid beneath my boots. That was the cold open of my private rebellion. Across the fence, Karen pushed her mower in jerky, furious lines. The sound stuttered each time she turned near the water's edge, as if her own engine shared her bitterness. She wouldn't look at me, not directly, but I saw her eyes flick just for a second toward the pier that glowed golden in the sunrise. Every day after, it was the same ritual. Me on the pier, her on the lawn. A quiet stage play of defeat and defiance. And you know what? I savored it. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, steady and relentless, like the lapping of water against new wood. But let me ask you, what happens when someone like Karen can't win, can't move on, and can't look away? What happens when the humiliation becomes its own fuel? Because one morning, weeks later, I noticed something strange. The mower line stopped short of the fence. A gap, bare and uneven, left untended right where her yard met my pier. Was it her way of drawing a line? A message I wasn't yet reading? I took another sip of coffee, the steam curling in the cool air, and I wondered, was this really the end of the war? Or just the start of something darker?